Hello, this is Professor Broker, and this is your Chapter 6 Lecture 1, Government Policy, Part 1. Let's begin. This is for Econ 231. You'll remember from Chapter 4 that we talked about how prices in the market system allocate resources, right? So if a group of students in Callaway County, Kentucky need more pencils, there's no pencil czar in charge of that allocation in Washington, D.C. So how are we going to get more pencils to students? Well, stores like Walmart are going to notice that pencils are flying off their shelves, right? There's an increase in demand, right, for pencils. So they're going to order more pencils from their wholesalers, right? Who are going to order more pencils from their manufacturers. The manufacturers are going to order more wood, more brass, more graphite, right? They're going to have their workers work longer hours. They're going to, how are they going to entice, right, their workers to work longer hours, to work more than, say, 40 hours a week? How are they, going to entice maybe to hire more workers away from other fields? How are they going to entice the wood producers, the loggers, to send wood to them and not to, the construction companies? How are they going to entice, the graphite producers and so on to send them their resources, right? It's all going to have to do with money and prices. They're going to have to offer higher prices. This is how prices for these scarce resources are going to get bid up. Therefore, the price of pencils is going to get bid up, right? And through that rising price, that's a signal to the economy, right, that we need more workers in this field. We need more resources in this field, right? All because students in Callaway County needed more pencils, right? And the price rose, okay, in the economy, throughout the economy. That told hundreds, maybe thousands of people around the world, right, valuable information about what to produce, how to produce it, who to send it to, what would be most profitable, right? And nobody was coordinating this. This was a totally decentralized process of people that didn't even know each other, maybe didn't even like each other, but yet they all worked together to get pencils to Callaway County for the students, all through the price system. Okay, that's how markets work, and that's what we talked about. Now, what happens if we mess with that system, though? That's what we're going to talk about in Chapter 6. So a good test case of that was in the 1970s, right? We had the OPEC oil crisis, basically. So in 1973, because of some political reasons, OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced that they were essentially going to not sell us oil to the United States anymore. Okay? And so, of course, at that time, we still imported a lot of oil from OPEC in the United States. And this obviously drove up the price of gasoline, among other things, electricity and things like that, substantially, right? You can imagine the economic turmoil of that. Now, what was the response, right? U.S. President Richard Nixon at the time enacted the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act, which basically, it did some other things, but it set price controls, basically saying that the price of gasoline could not rise much above previous levels before the OPEC oil embargo. So then the question becomes, markets were prevented from working normally. This is basically what this act did. Congress enacted it. The president signed it. What do we think would happen? Okay, so again, markets were not allowed to work normally. Okay, if markets worked normally, the price of gasoline would rise. Markets were not allowed to work normally. What do we think happened? Well, if you know anything about the 70s, right, there was a huge problem of shortages of gasoline. There were long lines at gas pumps. There wasn't enough gasoline in lots of places around the country. The government price controls further exacerbated the crisis. And there was artificial scarcity created across the country. Okay. Now, let me give you another test case where with high gasoline prices, right? So gasoline prices were very high in the 1970s. They were also high again in the how about 2008, right? So 2008 gas prices spiked right before the recession. I mean, we're talking $4, sometimes $5 a gallon. But here's what we know. There weren't massive lines at gas stations like there were in the 1970s. So similar supply and demand dynamics going on, right? You had features in the 1970s that wanted to drive up the price, but it was prevented. That created long lines at gas pumps. In 2008, right, gas prices, through some other factors, gas prices went up. They were allowed to go up this time, okay, to very high levels. Of course, we all hated it. We all shook our fists. We all, didn't like high gas prices. But one benefit of that is that there was always enough gasoline for anyone that wanted to put gasoline in their car, right? There wasn't rationing, there wasn't artificial scarcity, there was always enough. Okay, and the big difference here is that in 2008, markets were allowed to work normally, whereas in the 1970s, markets were not allowed to work normally. Okay, so there's a couple different ways we're going to talk about how governments can intervene in a market and try to affect the outcome, right? The government might deem, local, state, or federal government might deem that some market allocation is unfair. Okay, and indeed, it might appear on surface to be unfair in many cases, and so the government will want to step in many times to try to alleviate what they consider to be an unfair situation. One way they can do that is through price controls. Price controls come in two flavors. They can come in the form of a price ceiling, which is a legal maximum on the price of a good or service, saying the price of a good cannot rise above a certain level. And then the other flavor is a price floor. This is saying that the price cannot fall. The price has to at least be a certain price, okay? And so a price ceiling is obviously designed to protect consumers, right? So like rent control, we want to prevent prices of rent from rising too high, so the government institutes a price ceiling and says that, landlords can't charge above a certain amount. That's meant to protect consumers, okay? A price floor is a legal minimum. And so that's not designed to protect consumers. That's actually designed to protect sellers or producers, right? And so it might say, okay, so say for soybean farmers, we want to make sure they get at least a certain price for their soybeans, okay, so that they can operate a small family farm profitably. Okay, so that would be but again, these are both examples of government interventions in the market. We're going to look at how that changes the dynamic in the market. And then the other thing we'll look at is taxes. And so the government can intervene in a market through taxes, and we'll look at that dynamic. Okay, and we're going to use the supply and demand model we talked about in Chapter 4 to discuss and analyze the costs and benefits of these various government policies. We're not talking about any of these from a moral perspective. We're not going to ask the question or answer the question, is it right or wrong for the government to intervene? We can ask, what sort of costs are associated with a government intervention and what maybe are some of the benefits of a government intervention, and then people can decide for themselves if the benefits are worth the cost and so on. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is we want to look at price ceilings, and we're going to look at the market for apartments for that. Okay, so imagine we've got the price of apartments on the y-axis, the quantity of apartments, say in Murray, Kentucky, on the x-axis. We got a demand for apartments, upward sloping supply curve for apartments. Say equilibrium is $600 a month for an apartment, and there's 900 units bought and sold on in any given month, okay, in Murray, Kentucky. So this is equilibrium. Let's assume that our market starts in equilibrium. This is a competitive market, okay? The City Council of Murray has heard that tuition costs are rising. They decide they want to try to help some students. So they pass a price control, a price ceiling setting rent costs at a maximum of $1,000 per month to prevent the most egregious cases of landlord abuse. Okay, they can, of course, politicians, like always, they feel good about, any legislation they pass must be good, right? Because it's protecting the poor citizens of Murray. So they feel good about themselves. So let's see how this impacts our market situation, right? So what does equilibrium tell us? Equilibrium tells us that the market is cleared at $600, okay? In other words, buyers and sellers in the market are essentially happy at $600, right? And what is the $1,000 price ceiling? What does that do to the market? Think about what it says. It says, okay, look, you people in this market, right? You cannot charge, you landlords, more than $1,000. You cannot charge over $1,000 a month for your apartments. And of course, the landlords are going to look at themselves and say, well, we're not. We're charging $600 a month, okay, which is clearly legal, and that's where the market is satisfied at the moment. So the current equilibrium is legal underneath the new price ceiling. The market has no incentive to deviate from that equilibrium. Therefore, a price ceiling above equilibrium is what we call non-binding or not binding. It has no effect on the market whatsoever. Buyers and sellers are going to look at that and say, whoop-de-doo, who cares? It doesn't affect us. Okay, we're already charging something and buying and selling at a price below your legal maximum. Okay, so this is a price ceiling above equilibrium is not binding. Okay, well, students find out about this, and they find out that this new rent control doesn't have enough teeth. And so they start marching, in downtown Murray, and they decide they want to demand change. Okay, and so of course, the city council is going to act because they realize there's more student votes than there are landlord votes, and so they quickly capitulate and they lower the rent down to the price control down to $300 a month. So the new price control says that landlords cannot charge above $300 a month for an apartment. Okay, and they feel good. The city council feels good about protecting the poor students of Murray. Well, let's see. Okay, of course, on the surface, it appears that they will help the poor students of Murray, but let's see what the costs and benefits of this decision might be. Okay, so here we have our market. Equilibrium is $600. Okay, the new price ceiling is down here at $300. Okay, so where the market was previously satisfied, okay, that is now, the equilibrium of $600 is now illegal. Landlords cannot charge $600 for an apartment, and buyers cannot pay $600 for an apartment. Okay, they have to charge and they have to pay $300 or less. Now, how will this affect our market dynamic? Well, let's think about our supply and demand. At a lower price, what would we expect to happen to quantity demanded? Okay, well, quantity demanded because of the law of demand should increase, right? We would expect at the lower legal mandate of $300, we would expect more people want apartments. Okay, how might that work? Well, I'd imagine there's some people right now that are maybe living with roommates and so on in the $600 dynamic that now say, you know what, at $300 maybe I'll get my own place. Or there's people living at home or maybe living in the dorms that say, you know what, I wasn't going to pay $600 a month for an apartment, but at $300, why not, right? That'd be great. That would represent our increase in quantity demanded, right? But again, that's not the only side of the market. What about supply? Okay, what about supply? Well, you could easily imagine that there's people renting maybe their houses or some extra rooms in their house, for $600 a month that say, you know what, for $600 a month, this is worth it to rent out my house or to rent out, part of my house, or maybe, to college students. But at $300 a month, I don't know that I necessarily want someone living with me, or I don't know that I necessarily want to rent out my house. Maybe I just would rather sell it and get the cash up front, right? So you could imagine a situation where the lower legal mandate, the binding price ceiling, would decrease quantity supplied. In other words, this is a situation where the previous equilibrium is now illegal. This is a binding constraint that's going to increase, quantity demanded, decrease quantity supplied, and this would create a shortage. In fact, it would create a perpetual shortage that would not be eliminated because the price, the thing that could eliminate it, which is the rising price, would not be allowed to happen in this market dynamic. This is what's called a binding constraint that will create a distortion in the market. The distortion, when the price ceiling is below equilibrium, it distorts the market. It's binding, and the specific distortion that a binding price ceiling creates is a shortage. Okay. Now, we might begin to think about who benefits and loses from this case, because it's not all bad. Okay. I mean, some people are going to benefit, some people are going to lose or be worse off, right? The people that benefit are going to be this group of people right here. There's going to be 500 students, that are going to be able to get an apartment at the new lower price. Clearly, they're going to be better off, right? That's, yes. And so there are beneficiaries of this new policy. Now, who, though, is worse off? Because we want to think about all sides of the situation. Well, clearly, landlords are going to be worse off, right? I mean, the landlords that are renting these apartments to these 500 students for $300 used to be getting twice that amount of money, right? They used to be getting $600. So clearly, there is less money going to landlords. And maybe we're okay with that. Maybe these are, the super rich or something, I don't know, but maybe they're not, and so these are people, the landlords, who are clearly worse off. They're getting less money, but there's another group that's worse off, and it is the students. It's the very people the city council was trying to help, right? There are now 700, right? The different 700 students who want to find an apartment to live in, who now can't find an apartment to live in. That's this shortage here. Okay, there are students who want to have an apartment but now can't find one, and so they are clearly worse off. Okay, because of the binding price ceiling, which is below equilibrium. Now, some people have difficulty, remembering, when is a price ceiling binding, when is it not. A student of mine years ago came up with an analogy that I thought worked well, and I think it's helped students in the meantime. So I've been sharing it with people. Imagine, here you are, you're a person, okay, and imagine equilibrium is kind of in your torso area, and imagine getting off of an elevator, okay. If the ceiling's above you when you get off the elevator, is that usually a problem? Okay? No, of course not, right? That's not a problem. That would not put you in a bind, would it? But if you get off the elevator, okay, and the ceiling is at your knees, right? That means you're between floors. Is that going to be a problem? Of course it is, right? So if you walk off an elevator and the ceiling is above you, okay, like this, that's normal. That's not going to have any impact on your life whatsoever. You're not going to think twice about it. But if you get off the elevator, right, and the ceiling's at your knees, okay, that's going to put you in a bind, okay, and that's going to be a problem. Therefore, a price ceiling below you, imagine getting off the elevator, the price ceiling below your torso, okay, is an odd situation. It's different. It's going to put you in a bind. Therefore, a price ceiling below equilibrium would be binding. Let's apply this to a question. In which of the panels in the figure would there be a shortage of the good at the price ceiling? Again, which price ceiling, if you're getting off the elevator, would put you in a bind? When the ceiling's above you, like in panel A, or when the ceiling is below you, when the ceiling's at your knees, would that put you in a bind, right? Clearly, panel B would put you in a bind if this is your torso. Therefore, panel B would be the binding price ceiling, and panel B would create a shortage, which is answer B in this case. An example of this in the real world is Zimbabwe hyperinflation. Okay, in Zimbabwe, it cost to buy 3 eggs in July 2008. It cost $100 billion because of rampant price inflation. I don't have time to talk about why they had hyperinflation. Essentially, they just printed a bunch of money, which causes inflation, which was one of the 10 principles of economics from chapter 1. To try to curb the rising prices, Zimbabwe came up with a very novel strategy, and they basically said, hey, you can't raise your prices anymore, supermarkets or farmers. You can't charge high prices anymore. So they instituted price ceilings, thinking that that would stop the rising prices, that would stop the inflation. Of course, that did no such thing. All it did was it emptied the supermarkets, right? It created massive food shortages because price ceilings, binding price ceilings, will always create shortages. It will always create the fundamentals of market economics suggest that when you institute a binding price ceiling, there will always be a shortage, just simply because of the laws of demand. Just like the law of gravity says, if I throw an apple, off of the 10th story floor, it's going to fall to the ground. When I institute a binding price ceiling as the government, I'm going to create a shortage in our economy.